We hear arguments from inside the Idaho State Supreme Court as it took up the question of whether a voter-approved initiative expanding Medicaid is unconstitutional.
Conservative group Idaho Freedom Foundation filed the lawsuit against Idaho's Secretary of State. On the other side, the Attorney General's office calls the group's lawsuit meritless.
KTVB's Morgan Boydston is live outside the State Supreme Court building with what both sides told the justices of the state's highest court. Morgan.
Well, as a refresher, once implemented, Medicaid expansion would cover about 62,000 Idahoans who are considered in the coverage gap. Those are people who make too much to qualify for Medicaid, but not enough to get subsidies. The courtroom was packed and oral arguments lasted about an hour, with justices questioning both sides of the argument.
Matters before the court for oral argument.
At argument, the constitutionality of Proposition 2, Medicaid expansion, passed in November with about 60% of the vote. Idaho Freedom Foundation and its chairman brought the lawsuit forward, attempting to overturn what's now law.
If this court declares that the statute is unconstitutional, people are going to understand that and follow that.
IFF's attorney Brian Smith argued Medicaid expansion gives too much power to the federal government, allowing them to change eligibility requirements and the funding formula, while stripping authority away from the legislature.
Then what does that mean for other Idaho statutes that are tied to a federal standard? In particular, I'm thinking of Idaho Code 44-1502 that deals with the minimum wage.
Haven't we already ceded that responsibility to the federal government? And aren't you suggesting then that Medicaid in its current iteration would be unconstitutional?
Defending the Secretary of State, Assistant Chief Deputy Attorney General Brian Kane argued there are procedural issues with the case.
There is no clear legal duty for the Secretary to remove a statute from the code. Repeal of a statute is a legislative function.
Then the legislature is left with, is this good law or bad law? What are we going to do? So they're paralyzed, and then the people's will is also paralyzed.
An attorney for a group of people in the coverage gap and the Idaho Medical Association is siding with the state, saying Idaho is simply opting in and cooperating with the federal government.
Between those levels and 100%, there is no support for any kind of health care for those who are in that position. It creates the odd result of having virtually no place to go.
The AG argues the case is meritless, saying the Freedom Foundation didn't raise a single issue with legal foundation.
There's no delegation within the plain language of the statute to the federal government. It simply references a statute.
The court hasn't made a decision in this case, and there's no timeline they indicated as to when they could be done deliberating. Meanwhile, the state is asking the other side to pay reasonable attorney's fees.
All right, Morgan, thank you for getting us up to date. Interesting day at the Idaho Supreme Court.